This car was built to stand the test of time. Before supercars, before modern highways, there was a car so simple it could be fixed with basic tools anywhere in America, and it would go on to change the world. This is the Ford Model T. It had just 20 horsepower, a 2-speed transmission, no electric starter, and if you wanted to start it up, you might have to crank the engine by hand. And yes, that crank could kick back hard enough to seriously injure you. Yet this incredibly primitive-looking car would become one of the most important machines ever built. It's the Ford Model T, and to understand why it changed the world, you would have to watch it evolve, year by year. So let's just do that. From 1908 to 1927, Ford built more than 15 million Model Ts. The price of a new car fell from roughly $850 at launch to as little as $260 by the mid-1920s. 1908, the birth. The first production Model T was assembled at Ford's Piquette Avenue Plant in Detroit on September 27, 1908. Ford officially introduced it as a 1909 model, and the first customer car was shipped on October 1st. Under the hood was a 177 cubic inch, 20 horsepower 4-cylinder engine, driving through Ford's unusual 2-speed planetary transmission. And here's the first myth to kill. It wasn't born black. Early Model Ts were offered in several colors. The famous black-only poly, so I wouldn't come until 1914. 1909, Ford finds its audience. The first full model year saw more than 10,000 Model Ts produced, and Ford quickly discovered something important. People didn't necessarily want a fancy car. They wanted a car that was cheap, simple, tough, and easy to fix. That became the Model T's superpower. 1910, the move to Highland Park. Ford's Piquette Avenue factory couldn't keep up with demand, so Ford moved Model T production to the enormous new Highland Park plant in Michigan. This is where the Model T story gets really interesting, because Ford wasn't satisfied with simply building more cars. He wanted to completely reinvent how cars were built. 1911, the T goes global. Ford opened its first overseas factory in Trafford Park, Manchester, England. And the Model T was becoming more than a Detroit car. It was becoming an international product. Ford also sold bare running chassis, allowing customers and bodybuilders to turn the same basic machine into delivery vehicles, commercial vehicles, and specialized bodies. 1912, the universal car takes shape. The Model T was evolving rapidly. But here's another correction. Ford did not suddenly switch to all steel bodies in 1912. The Model T continued using wood-framed bodies with steel panels. What Ford was really perfecting was the chassis. Light, strong, simple, and designed to survive roads that were often little more than dirt tracks. And that toughness mattered, because in 1912, America wasn't exactly covered in smooth highways. 1913, the assembly line changes everything. This is the year the Model T becomes legendary. Ford began experimenting with assembly line production in 1913. By the end of the year, the moving assembly line was transforming how the car was built. Instead of workers walking around a car, the car moved through the factory, while workers performed specialized tasks. Ford eventually cut chassis assembly time from roughly 12 hours to about 90 minutes. Production exploded, and as production costs fell, Ford could cut the price. The Model T wasn't just getting cheaper. Ford had created a machine for making machines. 1914, black takes over. Now we get the famous black Model T. Ford introduced the black-only policy in 1914. Why black? Because the paint was durable, inexpensive, and, most importantly, it helped simplify production. So the famous saying about getting a Model T in any color, so long as it is black, finally made sense. But it wasn't true for the car's entire production run. Only the later part of the Model T's life was dominated by black. And 1914 wasn't just about paint. Ford also introduced the famous $5 workday, roughly doubling the existing daily wage while reducing the workday from 9 hours to 8. The idea was partly about keeping workers, and partly about creating workers who could afford the cars they were building. 1915, more practical, the same as the previous year. 1916, the T becomes America's car. Production kept climbing. By now, Model Ts were everywhere. Farmers drove them, doctors drove them, salesmen drove them, families drove them, and owners quickly discovered something Ford never originally intended. The Model T could become almost anything. People turned them into trucks, delivery vehicles, ambulances, fire apparatus, tractors, sawmills, and even snow machines. It wasn't just a car, it was a platform. 1917, meet the Model TT. Ford introduced the Model TT truck chassis. It used the Model T's basic engine and controls, but added a much stronger frame and heavier-duty rear axle. Now, the same basic idea that carried families could haul serious cargo. The Model T wasn't just putting America on wheels. It was helping put American business on wheels. 1918, the T dominates. By the end of the decade, the Model T had become overwhelmingly dominant in the American market. But Ford was already running into a problem. The car that made him famous was becoming a victim of its own success. Ford kept improving the production process, but the basic car remained remarkably unchanged. 1919, running behind. Ford's mechanical simplicity had helped make the T cheap, but competitors were beginning to offer conveniences that Ford was reluctant to adopt. 1920, the price war. Ford kept cutting prices as production efficiency improved. The Model T was becoming unbelievably cheap compared with the cars that came before it. But competitors were catching up. Chevrolet, Dodge, and others were offering more power, better styling, more comfort, and increasingly, more colors. The Model T's greatest strength was starting to become its greatest weakness. 1921, over 1 million. Ford's production machine was now operating at an incredible scale. More than 1 million Model Ts were produced in 1921. Imagine that. One basic car, produced over and over again, across a massive industrial system. And Ford's price cuts were making car ownership accessible to millions more people. 1922, the competition gets serious. Chevrolet was getting better, and Chevrolet offered things the Model T increasingly lacked. More horsepower, more style, and more modern feature. Ford responded mainly by making the T cheaper and more efficient to build. But the writing was starting to appear on the wall. 1923, the T gets a makeover. Ford finally gave the Model T a noticeable styling update. The bodies were lowered. The radiator became taller. The windshield angle changed. And for the first time, Ford offered both two-door and four-door sedan bodies. Production passed 2 million cars in a year. At its peak, the Model T was being produced on a scale that seems almost impossible today. But there was a problem Ford couldn't assembly line his way out of. People were getting used to better cars. 1924, the price hits rock bottom. The Model T became incredibly cheap. A basic T could be bought for around $260, which is about $5,095 in today's cash. That's the crazy part of the Model T story. Ford had taken a car that cost hundreds of dollars more when it launched and driven the price down through mass production and relentless cost cutting. But cheap wasn't enough anymore. Americans wanted something newer. 1925, the last big push. Ford tried to keep the T relevant. Balloon tires improved the ride. And Ford finally introduced a factory-built pickup body mounted on the Model T body. But here's another important correction. The $260 price people often quote for 1925 was for the runabout, not the touring car. The touring cost about $290. Still ridiculously cheap. But Ford was fighting a losing battle. Chevrolet offered more horsepower, more modern features, and more style. The Model T was becoming the old man of the automobile industry. 1926, too little, too late. Ford finally gave the Model T another major styling update. The body was lower and wider. The fenders became fuller. The hood and cowl were redesigned. Colors began returning, and the car looked much more modern. But underneath, it was still fundamentally the same machine Ford had designed nearly 2 decades earlier. And customers had moved on. 1927, the end. By 1927, Model T sales had collapsed. Ford finally admitted that the car needed to die. On May 26, 1927, Henry Ford and his son Edsel drove the ceremonial 15 millionth Model T out of the Highland Park plant. After nearly 19 years, the Model T was finished. Ford shut down production and began retooling for its replacement. And that's what makes the Model T so fascinating. It wasn't the fastest car. It wasn't the most comfortable. It wasn't even the first or last mass-produced automobile. But it changed the rules. Ford figured out how to build millions of cars cheaply enough that ordinary people could actually own them. The Model T changed how factories worked. It changed where people lived. It changed how Americans traveled. And it inspired an entire generation to modify the car for almost anything they could imagine. A tractor, a truck, an ambulance, a fire engine, even a snowmobile. For nearly 20 years, the Model T was America's car. And then, almost overnight, it wasn't enough anymore. That's the irony of the Model T. It didn't just put the world on wheels. It created a world that eventually wanted something better. And that's why the Model T isn't just one of the most important Fords ever built. It's one of the most important machines in history. If you want another car story broken down year by year, subscribe and tell me which one I should do next. Thanks for watching.